Well, hello there. I'm Teresa Norton, and I want to welcome you to the View from Abroad, where we take a look every week at one of the columns that ran in Hong Kong's South China Morning Post every Saturday from 1993 until 2000. And each week I invite a guest to choose one of those 30-year-old columns for us to discuss. And why? Because so much has changed in 30 years. And it's interesting to discuss and see what still feels relevant and what maybe feels a little out of step with the way we talk about things today. So my guest this week is Peirson Smith. He's a friend, and he's also the founder of Executive Counsel Limited, a Hong Kong-based strategic communications advisory to corporates on government relations and to the public and private sector on public relations, crisis management, and a number of other important things. Now, the column that Tim chose was this one, called Troubles a Brewin. I don't know, maybe I'm nuts, but it seems to me that a fellow who has made his way through a dungeon filled with sword-fighting sultans and skeletons, leapt over spike-filled pits, and crept through the jaws of death would be able to manage a simple exercise like making a pot of coffee without causing damage to life or property. My old man just recently developed an obsession with our son's Prince of Persia computer game, but I first became aware of Joe's coffee problem about 20 years ago. It seems like only yesterday that I was sitting in his mother's kitchen playing footsie under the table with the polyester and platform shoe-clad boy who would eventually become my husband. "Ma, can you make a pot of coffee? Nobody makes coffee like you do." "I put a little salt in with the grounds," she replied, reaching for the salt shaker. Could you make me a sandwich while you're up?" I thought as I gagged on the salty black brew. Does he really like this stuff, or was this all about not making the sandwich himself? 20 years and about 50,000 pots of coffee later, I can tell you, it wasn't his mom's coffee that was any good. He has a real thing about not making the coffee himself. And if he can get a sandwich thrown in as well... When we first moved in together, we had an old-fashioned drip coffee pot. He claimed he couldn't figure out how much water to add. We married, and I bought an automatic drip machine, the kind where the water measurements are marked on the glass pot. "How can you tell if you've got the right amount of grounds into that paper filter thing?" he shouted from the kitchen. "Just measure 2 heaping tablespoons," clattering from the silverware drawer. "Which one's a tablespoon? The spoon you use when you set the table, or the spoon you put on the table to serve the mashed potatoes?" "It's the spoon that's in the canister marked coffee." "How do you get this canister thing open? Do you twist or do you pinch that?" Struggling, grunting sounds. "Where's the broom?" I went back to the metal drip pot. "By the time the kettle of hot water is boiled, there's not enough water left to pour into..." I bought a glass kettle for boiling water in the microwave. "How the hell are you supposed to get the top off of this thing without sustaining second-degree burns?" A brewing disorder or a manipulative ruse? I'm no Sigmund Freud, but like all intelligent wives, I blame it on his mother. I've read Women Are from Venus, Men Are from Mars, and been told that we're speaking 2 completely different languages. Apparently, when he says, "How do you get this dustpan thing to..." what he means is, "I can't live without you, baby." Phooey. I'm writing my own book. If your man is from Mars, his mom probably sent him there. And how does he rate in dealing with those other common little household stumbling blocks? Can your man wash dishes? Oh, now, I don't mean can he dump plates covered in spaghetti sauce with the remains of a salad still intact into sudsy water. Can he scrape, rinse, wash, and arrange them in the dish rack without creating a glass and porcelain house of cards that collapses if you attempt to dry a fork? Do you find rolled-up dirty sock balls all over the bedroom and wet bath towels on the bed? Or does he put his dirty clothes in the hamper and hang the towel over the shower curtain rod? If he cleans up after himself and can make a good pot of coffee, you know who gets the credit. It's learned behavior. The pattern was set early on. If it weren't for your mother-in-law, you too might be married to a Martian. Now, I gotta go. My son's room is a mess, and he's begging me to make him a glass of my special lemonade. I put just a little extra honey in it. Welcome, Tim.
Hi, Teresa. Lovely to be back in contact.
It is so great to see you and so wonderful to hear your voice in my ear pans after many years. And congratulations. I realized that you are recently married, yes?
Very recently, in the last 6 months, yes, to the lovely Eileen.
Ah, the lovely Eileen. How wonderful. Well, congratulations on that. You were 35 years in Hong Kong, is that right?
That's right. I arrived, like so many people, 4th of October 1990 for initially a year, and I never left.
This column that you chose, what stands out to you as being particularly out of step with that column today?
Well, I actually thought how relevant it was and how the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, I think maybe it's a male thing to have these sort of learned dependencies, and I certainly associated with my mother. You know, the kind of salt in the coffee, you know, that type of point. I think is very true. I remember my mum always would make a special meal for me when I came back from college. So I sort of, it resonates quite a lot with me. And I just thought I'd throw this in because it's probably just a different sort of rather tangential view on things. So I have a thesis that any drink that is made by someone else for me tastes a whole lot better. Now, that might be a cup of tea, particularly, a coffee in the case of troubles of brewing, but also maybe a cocktail, a gin and tonic that you make for your friends or your partner. So I have this thesis that if someone makes me a cup of tea, I treat it with a lot more respect than just chucking a tea bag in, kind of brewing a pot of coffee. So I sort of agree that we do have these dependencies, and it's sort of part of the relationship that you do have these things. You know, we've all heard ourselves say, "You're much better at this, so you do that," and you know, we take a little bit of, you know, a bit of a smile. Okay, well, I'll do it. But in the Tim and Eileen world at the moment, we talking about hot drinks. We sort of stumbled into a routine where I do the chamomile tea at bedtime. That just always is the case. And I make a nice pot of chamomile tea, not the sawdust that you get in regular tea bags, but proper chamomile flowers. And I put it by the bedside for Eileen. And when I wake up in the morning, she's lovingly made me a oat milk fluffy coffee with a touch of cinnamon on the top. And she makes it much better than I could ever do.
Well,
I try
listen,
and replicate.
buddy, I got to stop you here and just say you have a completely different take on this column than I did. And it is really interesting and fun to hear from you on this. You know, I was looking at it and I was thinking to myself, my gosh, the way I am, you know, I have to say, my former husband, who is now a friend, but, you know, he was a very good sport. Because a lot of the columns that I wrote about married life, you know, he had to, you know, put up with me complaining about this, that, and the other thing. And I did make some what we would now consider, I think, very gross generalizations about male female roles and behaviors. But I love that you read this column and go, you know, it reminds me of my mom did special things for me. And when somebody makes me something to drink and I don't make it myself, it makes it more special. I thought he was just lazy. He was just trying to get me to do everything.
Absolutely. I think that was my first point, is that but you know, but we try to kind of please our partners, and we try to make them happy in whatever strange way it might be. And I think that's how I I take it.
Well, I love that. I think that's great, Tim. I think that's really lovely, and I think that you're a romantic guy, and that's something that you brought into your new marriage. So that's terrific. One of the things I do have to point out in that column was that although I did take the Mickey a lot out of, the fellas, in this particular one and in many of them, I end up taking the Mickey out of me.
You do?
Because here I'm saying, and if he turns out that he's got his socks rolled up on the floor and doesn't hang the towel up, you know who to blame, the mother.
Mm-hmm.
But then at the end of the column, I'm the mother who
Full
goes,
circle. Yeah, I thought that was a fabulous structure to the piece, that you went full circle onto your son is effectively where you're effectively doing the same with your son.
A lot of the stuff I wrote was there to be funny, and maybe it's not so funny anymore.
Well, yeah, I think that you make a very good point then. I guess in 30 years ago, when your kids were growing up and mine were growing up, we didn't have any of these sort of social media friends. So, basically we were the oracle. We were how they, hopefully how they kind of become independent and live their own lives.
Well, and I look at it and I think to myself, when I was a sort of a tween, right? You get to be about 10, 11, 12. The influence of your peer group really starts to override the influence of your parents. Of course, what was modeled for me was a very kind of old school, I Love Lucy kind of household. I mean, my dad wasn't singing Babalu at the, Tropicana Club, but, he was out working and earning money, and my mom was at home. And I think that when I was writing the column, it was at a time in history when women were starting to take the piss out of that old model, right?
Yeah, liberation in some degree. Yeah, I was the same. My father was always the breadwinner, and was initially one of three, and then surprise, surprise, mum and dad were still had a fabulous relationship, and 12 years my junior, number four arrived, and my dad, throughout all of that, he had a daytime job. He sold cars if he could make a few pounds on polishing or fixing a car and selling it through the classifieds. Then when another one came on, my youngest sister, he ended up selling villas in Spain. That's what he did. And throughout all of that, my mum was the bedrock. She was the one who, whenever you came home, she was there. There was kind of food on the table. And, it definitely shaped me. I'm sure it shaped, people of our generation, certainly shaped you, I would imagine.
Yeah. I was thinking to all of those television sitcoms that came out at about the time when I was writing these columns. And there were shows like, I watched a lot of them from the US. And there were shows like, Roseanne Barr had a show.
Oh, fabulous. Yeah.
Right. And also Home Improvement. A lot of stand-up comics had shows that really had the wife being sort of the smart, a more assertive one, and the husband sort of bumbling through. It certainly, I think, had an impact on the way that I was approaching comedy and approaching things that I thought was funny. But it's different. It's very different today. I mean, you can't watch old episodes of almost anything and not think, wow,
yeah,
that would not work today.
Yeah, I think, a lot of British comedy is sort of quite edgy, and things like Little Britain, which was a huge hit. We all watched it, and it was, wow, that's a little bit edgy. It's almost
even at the time.
Even at the time, and now it's, you just think, wow, we couldn't do that. Now, what I would do to temper that is that, I think we can go too far in terms of, trying to be so politically correct. I actually quite like a world where James Bond is very male and very heterosexual, and I think we may be kind of dancing into an area where things are changing. And everyone talks about woke, and but I think I think those values that we were given were pretty good. I think they've served me as a human being. I think they've served me well as a parent, which I'll talk about kind of a little bit later, because that was sort of what I took from your fabulous article. But yeah, I think they serve the values that we had 30 years ago and more have served as well.
Well, going back more than 30 years, I feel very grateful that I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, because a lot of the things that are considered woke, for lack of a better word today, that level of acceptance of difference and different ways of being and different backgrounds of people that was just the way it was in San Francisco in the 70s. I mean, I was coming into my adulthood in an environment that was so open and welcoming to all different varieties of sexual identity and racial background. And in fact, I can remember going back to the San Francisco Bay Area years later, having thought we have everything solved. This is the promised land, and going back and finding it very divisive and like we moved back in the wrong direction. So anyway, listen, let's stop this for a second, because we're going to take a little commercial break here.
Great.
And I want to hear about the charity that you've chosen, and then come back and talk a little bit about the personal story that you want to share that came out of reading that column, was stimulated by that. All righty, here we are. And Tim, you are, you're a self-professed lapsed Brit. Also, you're a bird watcher, a former environmental research scientist, an avid swimmer, and a proud father and husband. And you support a particular charity that I'm familiar with, but it'd be great for you to share with our audience.
Yeah, delighted to. Thanks, Teresa. The charity that I'd really like, to given this sort of free advertising space, is something that I've worked with pro bono. It's called the Crossroads Foundation. Hong Kong is a place where there are some very famous international brands. We've got Mandarin Oriental, we've got Peninsula Hotel, we've got Cathay Pacific. I think much higher and much better than those brands is the Crossroads Foundation. And what it is, it's a charity that was established many years ago by two very dedicated people, Malcolm and Sally Begbie. And now their kids are involved in that charity going forwards. And what they do is that they take the office furniture, including computers, routers, all sorts of things, and they find homes internationally for these. So, when Goldman Sachs upgrades its computers, they now, in Hong Kong, they would now give them to the Crossroads Foundation, which is www.crossroadsfoundation.org.hk. And they find homes, and it might be in, South Sudan, it might be the Congo, it might be in anywhere where there's a need. And when they first set this charity, and China, obviously, and when they first set this foundation up, there were no kind of matching agencies between people who had the need for, say, a computer or office furniture or a bed or a sofa, And they have not only developed an amazing charity, but they've actually been credited by the United Nations for setting up a database that matches needy people with products that we would otherwise potentially throw away or put into a landfill. So, huge shout out for them. I don't know whether there are other charities internationally like it, but it's one I'm so proud of. And it is a real Hong Kong success story. It's a fantastic brand.
I certainly know that whenever I and friends of mine had items to give away, Crossroads was always someplace you thought of, because you thought if it's something that is useful, they'll find the person who can use it. And we are back. And I am desperate to hear what word or idea spawned a true story from your past, Tim, to share with us today.
Well, it was sort of embedded through the whole piece. I love the fact that your husband was kind of learning computer games. And so that made me very much think of kind of our role as parents. And I kind of what it made me think of, and the balled up socks on the floor, was the sheer chaos of family life, the blur of time passing, ever faster. For me, family life was sort of Sunday shuttling girls and boys to mini rugby, hungover or not hungover. I used to wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning to take my kids to horse riding, which I do think is a life skill, and literally had little girls and boys kind of jumping out of their jobs in the back of the car and throwing on their school uniform and literally screeching to a halt outside the school just kind of seconds before the school gates closed. Taking girls to ballet, to drama. Just the head spin of it was what I picked up from your article. And then I thought, really, that was so noisy and so loud. It then went to what I would call a loud silence, the empty nesting, which happened so quickly. And, eerily quiet home, the challenges that come with that adjustment for the parents of kind of being back on your own. And then a kind of lurching at almost sort of like such kind of Mach speed to the fear and trepidation of these kids that we'd produced and nurtured and tried to make independent, and the trepidation of when they themselves kind of left the home to go to college or to go to university. And I just remember the kind of the visceral fear of kind of on one part of me hoping that the kids would make friends, but anxious that they would call just to let us know that they're still alive, which of course they didn't call, and they didn't, but they didn't because they'd made friends, so our anxiety was sort of was not necessary. And they've made their way in the world. They kind of become independents, and sort of I always sort of thought at that point, that our work is done. But of course, it isn't done, because you're still there. You're there as what I would call BOMAD, the bank of mum and dad, still. My kids range from 23 to 30, but in the world that we live in, I think BOMAD is really important to sort of support them in the kind of very complicated world. But we're also still that kind of shoulder to cry on, which I think is makes you feel wanted. And then the college holidays, that kind of suddenly it all reactivates and it becomes loud, and you've got the laundry, and then watching them establish themselves as individuals and make their own mistakes with relationships. And just recently, two of the older ones have started making their own homes, watching the pride and the curation of their own spaces and their tastes, and patience in turning houses and flats into homes, and actually sort of almost seeing glimpses of yourself in the homes that they make. And now, I guess, to sort of conclude my kind of think piece, I'm now awaiting or anticipating if they're lucky and if they want kids to move on to the next stage myself. The possibility of being a grandparent and them having grandchildren. And so we go kind of full circle, and looking forward to scoop them up and take them out and fill them full of sweets and candy and swing them around in the park and hand them back to their giddy and exhausted to their own mums and dads.
When you're exhausted.
Exactly. So
Well,
that's what I
listen.
took of it. I love the chaos that was
Yeah.
in that piece.
Let me ask you, going back, just sort of double clicking on that idea of empty nest. I think it is sort of underplayed how traumatic that can be for some parents, that can really be a heartbreaking thing to have that last child go off and suddenly realize that all of that noise, as you point out, has quieted down, and your role as a parent is not finished, but it's changed. And that brings me to that other thinking of that point at which the parent becomes like a child. And of course, I had that beautiful conversation with Teresa Robbins-Dodick about my mom, who had Alzheimer's, and her mom, who had dementia, and thinking about how important it is for me, anyway, to make clear to my kids that when and if that time comes, I'm not going to be a difficult person to manage. The whole idea of I'm not moving out of this house, and the reluctance to get old and change. I just don't want it to be that way for my kids.
Just picking up on that, Teresa, I certainly kind of took a lot out of that piece. I'm the same. My lovely mummy, she had Alzheimer's for the last 7 years of her life, and it does. It's kind of that moral dilemma. I mean, I saw, from my perspective, it was my father, the carer, who actually need to be cared for, and the need for respite. But my dad was they were still kind of madly in love, and I remember kind of with my mum passed away, mum and dad both passed away during COVID, which many, I'm sure, of your listeners can associate that. And the way I wrote the eulogy, I used it as an opportunity to sort of say, we've got mum back now, because the person who was living with dad for the last 6 or 7 years, particularly the last 3 or 4, was not really my mummy. It wasn't his wife, and it wasn't, the friend. And so when we had the eulogy given online, of course, because I was stuck in Hong Kong. But it basically allowed us to remember our mother pre all of her Alzheimer challenges, and remembering her running around the garden with a Hot Wheels track and kind of clucking me on the back of the legs for, again, being naughty. So we sort of almost got my mum back when she passed. But no, I think it's the most desperate thing, and maybe that's a charity I should have chosen. I mean, we've got to find a cure for that, because all other kind of medical advances are keeping us much older than maybe we're even supposed to be. Very.
That's a great point. Yeah, so, the things that our generation and our kids' generation have to consider in terms of elder care are things that simply didn't weren't a consideration, because people died when they were in their late 60s. If you go back to the turn of the century, not the turn of this century, but of the previous one. Yeah. So, I guess there's just kind of talking about the fact that you've got an empty nest when your kids leave. There is also that emptiness as a child when you come back and realize that a lot of the things that were familiar about your parents are no longer part of the equation, right? I remember my brother saying that one of the things that really was hard for him was when my mom, decided that she wasn't going to be making Christmas cookies that year. And
Yeah.
he saw that as a tipping point, and he was right. That was sort of the beginning of a very different phase of her life. So,
Yeah.
well,
I,
listen.
I, I remember I remember similar to that observation. I can really clearly remember the last time my mother said goodbye, and she was fully aware that it was me. But I then know my amazing dad was, every time we came home, particularly with our kids, he literally would sit her down and probably with photos and say who we were and where we were, and I can very, very clearly remember kind of standing on the doorstep, kind of kissing mum goodbye and her giving me a really good hug. And the next time I came back, she had that look.
And just to end it on an up note, the thing that stands out to me in your story is you saying how in love they were, your parents. And it feels like, I said earlier that you've always struck me as a bit of a romantic. I can see where that must have come from if you had parents that were demonstrably in love with each other. And that, I think, is a lovely way for us to wrap up this podcast that began with a column that didn't sound so loving, but story of your own that redeems the column and wraps up this show nicely. Thank you so much for joining us, Tim Peirson Smith. It's been a pleasure to see you.
Thanks, Teresa. Absolute delight to be talking to you.
Great. Breathe all the time. Come up slowly. And whatever you're going through, whether it's with your parents or your kids or your partner, hang in there because, hey, what if it's good?